Inside the silent halls of Windsor, what was supposed to be a calm family meeting for unity erupted into one of the most shocking scenes in royal history. With everyone watching, King Charles locked eyes with his wife and coldly stripped her of her royal title right there in front of the entire room. This gathering wasn't meant to be dramatic. It had only been announced to a small circle of senior royals, framed as a gentle evening of reflection and togetherness to steady the family during shaky times. But behind those carefully worded invitations and polished smiles, something sinister was bubbling. The moment they walked in, the tension hit hard. The air was thick, almost suffocating, like everyone already knew something huge was about to happen. Eyes darted, whispers faded, and every step on the marble floor sounded like a drumbeat leading to disaster. Then came Charles. He looked fragile, his shoulders hunched with age and illness, but his gaze told a whole different story. His eyes were razor-sharp, fixed, and unshakable, nothing like the weak figure the public often imagines. That night, there was fire in him, a cold determination that felt almost eerie for a man long branded as hesitant. One thing was certain, this was no ordinary royal meeting. He sat in silence for what felt like an eternity before anyone even dared to whisper a word. His presence alone controlled the entire room. No coughs, no shifting chairs, not even a breath too loud. The weight of his silence pressed down on everyone like a crown too heavy to bear. Then Camilla made her entrance, carrying that same trademark mix of confidence and calculation that had defined her climb. She swept into the room believing this was her moment, a meeting she thought would solidify her role, proving once and for all that she belonged as the steady Queen Consort by Charles's side. That faint smile on her face told the story. She expected respect, acceptance, maybe even applause. In her mind, this was a coronation in all but name. But what she didn't see, or maybe refused to admit, was the storm already circling her chair of power. William and Catherine walked in next, their movements sharp, their steps perfectly aligned. Their faces were stone, their eyes cold, as if they already knew this night would not end with smiles and celebration, but with a royal clash no one could ignore. They didn't utter a single word to Camilla, not even a polite nod in her direction. Their silence spoke louder than any insult could, and the message was crystal clear. William's eyes flickered toward Charles, then back to Catherine, like they were speaking in a secret language only they understood. Every glance carried weight, a silent agreement that this was the night they had been waiting for. They had watched the power in the family shifting piece by piece, and now the final move was about to land. And then came Princess Anne, seated firmly near the head of the table. Her face was carved into pure neutrality, but the calm in her eyes was like steel. For those who knew her best, that steady composure said more than words ever could. Anne wasn't rattled, she wasn't swayed, she was bracing herself, knowing exactly what storm was about to break loose. It was a stillness heavy with meaning, not born from ignorance but from certainty. Anne wasn't lost in the moment, she was locked into it. She had always been the crown's quiet guardian, the unshaken enforcer of tradition, and her silence tonight felt like a warning that she already knew exactly how this scene would unfold. The atmosphere grew unbearable, every second stretching like a pendulum about to slam down and shatter everything. Then it happened. Charles cleared his throat. Such a small, ordinary sound, yet it cracked through the silence like thunder. Instantly, every head in the room snapped toward him. Camilla's smile trembled, just enough to betray her nerves. William's jaw clenched hard, his face tightening with barely contained tension. Catherine lowered her gaze, but the faint curve of her lips gave her away. It was the hint of quiet satisfaction, almost like she had seen this moment coming all along. Anne didn't flinch. She sat perfectly still, her eyes locked onto her brother with an intensity that dared him to finish what he had started. And then it happened. Words no one in that room ever thought they would hear burst from Charles's lips. His voice wavered only once, but the weight behind it was undeniable, heavy with finality. In a tone that left no room for debate, he announced that Camilla would no longer carry the royal title she had walked in with. The declaration cut through the air like a blade, sharp and irreversible. The silence that followed wasn't calm, it was crushing. It wasn't the peace of quiet, but the kind of silence that screams with everything unsaid, everything boiling beneath the surface. Gasps broke out across the table, the kind people can't hold back no matter how hard they try. Camilla's hand shot to the table, gripping it like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing under the weight of humiliation. William's eyes locked on his father, flashing with both raw shock and something darker, a strange sense of inevitability, as if deep down he had known this night was coming all along. This wasn't a decision tossed out carelessly, and it was one that could never be taken back. In that single instant, the carefully polished illusion shattered, and every crack hidden within the royal family burst wide open. Charles's frailty, his age, his illness, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was his voice, his command, his iron authority as he dropped the ultimate blow. For Camilla, the sting was pure humiliation, a public stripping of everything she thought she had secured. For William and Catherine, it was vindication, the moment they had silently craved, finally unfolding right before their eyes. And for Anne, it was nothing less than confirmation, a truth she had been bracing herself for, now laid bare in front of them all. But this wasn't born from a single night or a single meeting. This moment was the result of years of quiet tension, hidden battles, and power plays finally exploding into the open. This wasn't just one dramatic night. It was decades of suspicion, secret conflicts, and hidden choices finally exploding into the open. What the world thought was a polished royal marriage was, behind palace walls, quietly falling apart. Insiders whisper that Charles had been bracing for this exact day long before Camilla even sensed danger. The cracks didn't appear out of nowhere. They spread slowly, almost unseen, masked by ceremonies, perfect smiles, and carefully rehearsed words meant to fool the public. On the surface, the king and his queen consort looked like a united front, the picture of stability. But those deep inside the palace knew better. Beneath the polished image, there was a constant unease, a tension that couldn't be ignored. Those closest to Charles saw the shift happening before anyone else. His patience with Camilla's growing influence was fading fast, and that patience, already strained under the crushing weight of the crown, was on the verge of snapping. Every quarrel behind closed doors, every clash that never made the headlines, was like another brick stacked onto a wall, threatening to split the monarchy right down the middle. The first warning signs started showing not long after Charles took the throne. At first, Camilla was praised for her resilience, her skill in handling the public, the woman who had weathered scandal and survived. But once Charles ascended, her confidence turned into something sharper. She began to push further than Charles could accept. What started as minor disputes, arguments over ceremonial roles, who should stand where, who should take precedence at key events, quickly escalated into a battle of power. Protocols that once seemed untouchable became weapons in a fight for control. Charles clung fiercely to the old traditions, determined to preserve the crown's authority, while Camilla pushed harder, demanding recognition that stretched far beyond the title she held. The palace had turned into a chessboard, and neither side was willing to back down. These quiet power plays, hidden from the public eye, were eating away at Charles day by day. He knew the danger. Once protocol was bent, the very foundation of the monarchy could start to crack. What made it worse was Camilla's steady push to weave her own family into the royal fabric, a move Charles saw as crossing a sacred line. Her children, her relatives, they began showing up closer and closer to the heart of royal life, sliding into spaces once reserved only for Windsor blood. To Camilla, it may have looked like a natural blending of families, but to Charles, it was something far more dangerous. It was encroachment. The idea that her bloodline was inching toward the crown's inner circle set alarms ringing. Whispers started swirling through palace corridors. Was Camilla quietly shaping a legacy not for the monarchy, but for her own family's rise? Each time her relatives were suggested for roles tied to royal tradition, Charles's patience frayed. What he felt instead was something sharper, cornered, betrayed, and deeply unsettled. Things spiraled when Camilla's grip extended into royal charities, sparking whispers that grew louder with every move she made. What began as seemingly noble efforts to help turned into sharp accusations of overreach. Trustees and long-standing royal patrons, people who had stood by the family for decades, started murmuring that Camilla was redirecting influence and resources to shine the spotlight on herself, placing her own name above the crown. The public never saw the brewing storm, but inside palace walls, the pressure was fierce. Charles was being pulled in two directions: protect the institution that defined him, or protect the marriage he had fought so long to defend. For a man who had already spent his life battling scandal and criticism, the thought of his reign being clouded by whispers of Camilla's ambition was unbearable. And just when the tension reached its breaking point, Catherine quietly stepped into the spotlight. Unlike Camilla, Catherine had mastered the delicate balance between tradition and modernity. She could read the public mood like no one else, and she knew the truth, that patience for Camilla was far thinner than the palace dared to admit. Behind closed doors, Catherine reportedly delivered a blunt warning to Charles. If Camilla kept pushing her authority, it would spark backlash and tear open wounds that Diana's memory had never allowed to heal. Her words cut deep. Charles listened, caught between the loyalty he owed his wife and the undeniable truth staring him in the face. Catherine was the monarchy's future, and her instincts were rarely wrong. Those words didn't just fade. They stayed with him, echoing like a shadow in his mind, a reminder that to protect the crown, he might be forced to make the most painful choice of his life. Meanwhile, William began to quietly pull away. It was subtle, but impossible to ignore for those watching closely. He skipped out on her initiatives, attended fewer of her engagements, and when he did appear, his words of support grew colder, shorter, almost perfunctory. To the public, it could be brushed off as scheduling conflicts, nothing serious, but insiders knew better. This was deliberate. William understood the stakes. If he tied himself too closely to Camilla, he'd risk alienating a public that already saw Catherine, not Camilla, as the true standard-bearer of the monarchy's future. Every quiet withdrawal, every missed appearance by William, was another move tilting the balance of power toward his side of the family. Charles couldn't ignore it. The message was written loud and clear. His heir would not tie himself to Camilla's fate. And looming in the background was Princess Anne, steady in her silence, but firm in her stance. She never needed to raise her voice. Her stillness said everything. From the very beginning, she had never fully embraced Camilla's role, and her guarded looks only deepened the sense that Charles was standing on shaky ground. For Anne, loyalty wasn't to individuals, it was to the crown itself. To her, anyone who threatened the purity of that institution was a danger, no matter how close they sat to the throne. Her disapproval hung heavy, another shadow at the table, a constant reminder that even within his own bloodline, Camilla would never have the full respect she craved. Piece by piece, the cracks multiplied. What once looked like family unity was now nothing more than a fragile facade, barely holding together. Each confrontation, every whispered warning, every subtle distancing from his children and sister painted the truth in stark colours, and Charles could no longer deny it. The monarchy was already divided. If Charles failed to act, it wouldn't just be his marriage at risk. The crown itself would pay the price. The cracks behind palace walls were bad enough, but the real danger was bigger. The monarchy itself was on the verge of splitting in two. Charles knew the clock was ticking. He had to move before the damage became irreversible. Beyond the palace gates, the storm was already raging. The public mood was shifting fast, and the whispers against Camilla were no longer whispers at all. They were a roar. What started as quiet murmurs of doubt had swelled into open criticism, blasting through newspapers, sparking fiery debates on television panels, and echoing across countless dinner tables. Everywhere, the question was the same. Could Camilla ever truly be accepted? The monarchy had always lived and died by the court of public opinion, and Charles now faced the chilling truth. The very survival of the crown might depend on removing the woman who was once meant to steady it. Charles had survived decades of headlines and judgment, but the backlash now aimed at Camilla was harsher than anything he could have braced for. Every public appearance she made, every carefully written speech she delivered seemed to backfire, fueling resentment instead of softening it. Crowds that once offered polite applause now met her with a chilling quiet, their skepticism written on their faces for all to see. For a monarchy built on spectacle and unity, that silence was more dangerous than boos or protests. It was indifference, and indifference, in the world of royals, could be fatal. The silence spoke of a public slipping away, no longer invested in the image the palace tried to project. And while the mood outside grew colder, the media circled like predators, sharpening their knives and preparing to feast on the spectacle of a queen consort losing her grip. Reports started to swirl, and they weren't just about Camilla anymore. They dragged her family straight into the storm. Headlines zeroed in on their wealth, their business ties, and the perception that they were trying to ride the wave of her royal status. Journalists dug deep, unearthing old connections, questioning every motive, and crafting a picture of a queen consort driven not by duty, but by hunger for power. Each headline was another blow, each article another crack, tearing down her carefully built image. The palace tried to push back, releasing polished photographs and glowing statements, but it was useless. The tide was turning fast. For every staged smile, there were double the accusations ready to hit back harder. Charles could see it clearly. Once trust slipped through their fingers, reclaiming it was almost impossible. And as if that wasn't enough, whispers from inside the palace began to spread. Rumours of a growing rift between Camilla and Catherine. Leaks painted explosive scenes of heated exchanges, with Camilla trying to assert control over areas Catherine had nurtured with patience and care. The image of harmony was gone. This was open rivalry. Whether true or exaggerated, the stories spread like wildfire, feeding a public eager for drama. The contrast between the two women was too stark to ignore. Catherine, graceful and reserved, embodying the promise of renewal. Camilla, burdened by history, accused of clinging to a crown that was never truly hers. Each headline became another weapon in the arsenal of public discontent, and Charles knew the comparison was impossible to contain. And then came the ghost, the one who had never truly left, the shadow of Princess Diana. Decades after her death, her presence remained unshakable, her memory woven into the very fabric of the monarchy. For many, Diana was still the true queen of hearts, the woman wronged, the symbol of compassion and vulnerability. Her legacy grew with each passing year, her story taking on an almost mythic weight. Against such a force, Camilla's image could never stand untarnished. For every step she took into the light, Diana's shadow only stretched further, casting doubt, stirring resentment, and reigniting old wounds. To the public, Camilla was not just a consort. She was a reminder of betrayal, a rival who had stepped into shoes that were never meant for her. Every image of Diana in the press was placed beside one of Camilla, and the contrast was merciless. Diana symbolized compassion, tragedy, and sacrifice. Camilla, in the public imagination, symbolized scandal, survival, and ambition. The weight of that comparison became unbearable, not just for Camilla, but for Charles, who watched the legacy of the woman he once loved resurface to haunt the reign he had only just begun. The unease reached the corridors of Parliament, where whispers of concern grew louder. Insiders began to quietly question whether Camilla's presence was harming the monarchy's stability rather than reinforcing it. Politicians who once offered unwavering respect to the king now tread carefully, hinting that reforms, or worse, interventions, might become necessary if the crown continued to lose its grip on public trust. For Charles, it was more than political discomfort. It was a personal reckoning, the past colliding with the present in a storm he could no longer command. Each rumour, each headline, each cold silence from the crowds reminded him that the throne he had spent his life waiting for was far less secure than he had ever imagined. It was a warning shot. When Parliament began to murmur, the throne itself trembled. Even abroad, there was disquiet. Reports filtered back to Charles that certain donors, allies, and even foreign dignitaries were beginning to question Camilla's suitability as a figurehead. Some privately expressed hesitation about associating too closely with her during state visits, fearing that her image would tarnish their own reputations. The monarchy's influence had always extended beyond Britain, shaping diplomatic ties and reinforcing soft power across the globe. To hear whispers that even allies were second-guessing their association was a sign Charles could not ignore. The crown was not only a domestic institution, it was a global emblem of continuity and prestige. And now that emblem was in jeopardy. The weight of all these forces, public discontent, media exposés, parliamentary whispers, and international unease, pressed heavily on Charles's shoulders. What had once seemed a private struggle within his marriage had transformed into a battle for the very survival of the crown itself. Every day he delayed, The anger outside grew louder, the suspicion deeper, and the cracks wider. It was no longer a question of if he would act, but when. But what truly forced Charles's hand wasn't public opinion. It was the explosive secret revealed inside his own home. When Charles uncovered the truth about what Camilla had been planning in secret, he realized her crown wasn't just in danger, so was the monarchy itself. It began with whispers, faint traces of meetings that should never have taken place, and names that had no place in the corridors of power. Advisors with no official role were suddenly present at private gatherings, their influence creeping into rooms once reserved only for the sovereign's most trusted circle. Charles, who had spent a lifetime shielding the crown from manipulation, could not ignore what was unfolding. The Queen Consort was engaging with outsiders, and the nature of those conversations was far from innocent. To him, it looked less like counsel and more like a conspiracy. One that threatened not just his reign, but the integrity of the monarchy itself. They were not about charity or ceremonial duties. They were about power, legacy, and a future that placed her family above the royal bloodline itself. The most shocking discovery came in the form of a draft speech. It was never delivered publicly, but its very existence sent shivers through Charles's core. Written in careful, deliberate language, it positioned Camilla not simply as a consort, but as a central guiding force within the monarchy, while elevating her own family as figures worthy of recognition and influence. It was nothing less than a direct challenge to the sanctity of succession, a rewriting of tradition that sought to weave her bloodline into the very fabric of the monarchy's story. For Charles, it was a betrayal more profound than any marital quarrel. It was a quiet coup, one that used his reign as the canvas for someone else's legacy. His fury reached its peak when he uncovered documents stamped with his name, signatures implied where none had been given. These were not clerical errors. They were calculated acts, deliberate projections of authority forged without his sanction. To the king, it was more than deceit. It was treasonous in spirit, if not in law. He felt the monarchy slipping from his hands, its centuries of lineage and loyalty being reshaped by those with no rightful claim to its throne. The quiet confidence Camilla had displayed in recent weeks suddenly revealed itself as something else entirely, the confidence of a woman building her own empire within his crown. It was Princess Anne who forced the matter fully into the open. Loyal, unyielding, and unwilling to see their mother's legacy tarnished, she reportedly brought the evidence to Charles with a bluntness only she could wield. Documents, testimonies, whispers from staff, all laid out before him like the final pieces of a puzzle he had long avoided assembling. Anne's message was unmistakable. Camilla was stepping far beyond her role, and if he did not act, the monarchy would bear scars that might never heal. The confrontation between brother and sister was tense, each word carrying the weight of generations. But in Anne's sharp truths, Charles found the clarity he had been searching for. In the weeks that followed, his conversations with William grew increasingly heavy. No longer were they about ceremonial duties or public schedules, they were about survival. William, cautious but firm, pressed the urgency of protecting the crown, even if it meant dismantling the marriage that had once seemed unshakable. Father and son sat together, sometimes in silence, sometimes in fierce debate, wrestling with the reality of what Camilla's actions meant. William urged caution, but also pressed the truth that the monarchy's survival depended on drawing a line. They spoke of Diana, of legacy, of the fragile trust of a nation that could not endure another betrayal. For Charles, these exchanges cemented the decision that had already been forming. He would have to act, not in whispers, not in quiet corrections, but with a gesture so powerful it would silence the doubt forever. By the time the family meeting was called, the decision was no longer in question. Charles knew the price would be devastating, both personally and publicly. But in his mind, the alternative was worse. Camilla had crossed into a realm no consort should ever enter, threatening to reshape the crown for her own gain. Only a decisive act, brutal in its clarity, could restore order to a monarchy unraveling under the weight of secrets. The room that day carried an unnatural stillness, every family member summoned under the guise of necessity, but sensing the storm about to break. Camilla arrived with her usual poise, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to see, that her fate had already been sealed. And when Charles finally rose to speak, the silence that followed was the sound of history turning. It was not just paper. It was a verdict, a declaration that could not be undone once spoken. The seal glinted under the chandelier light, a reminder that what was about to happen was not merely personal, it was institutional, binding, eternal. Charles's eyes lingered on the words one last time before lifting his gaze to the woman who had stood beside him through scandal, through reinvention, through the fragile first years of his reign. For a heartbeat, the room expected him to falter, to retreat into the softer instincts of a husband rather than the steel of a king. But the pause ended. His voice, low and steady despite the tremor in his hand, cut through the air. "From this day forward," he began, each syllable weighed down by the gravity of centuries, "Camilla shall no longer bear the title of Queen Consort." Gasps erupted, some stifled, others sharp and audible. The words hung in the chamber like a death toll, each one striking at the very heart of the woman seated before him. Camilla's face drained of colour. Her hand clutched the table as though the wood itself might keep her from collapsing. William leaned forward, eyes narrowing as if trying to read the precise meaning in his father's tone. Catherine's lips parted, but she said nothing, the faintest flicker of vindication passing across her face before she lowered her gaze again. Anne, still and unblinking, met her brother's stare with the certainty of one who had long awaited this reckoning. Charles set the document down. The echo of parchment against oak was louder than a gavel. The words landed like a hammer blow, and for the first time, Camilla's mask fully broke. Her eyes glistened, not with sorrow, but with rage contained by the thinnest of threads. She turned to William, desperate, searching for even the faintest hint of support. His face remained stone. Catherine did not raise her eyes, and Anne's silence was as damning as any verdict ever spoken. Camilla was alone, utterly alone. Anne had always been the enforcer of duty, the one who could stomach the brutal necessities others flinched from. Her nod didn't soothe Charles. It sealed his choice like a stamp of inevitability. Camilla, though, could no longer bite her tongue. Her voice cracked with raw desperation as she erupted, disbelief spilling into rage. She hurled accusations at Charles, crying betrayal, humiliation, and the destruction of the marriage they had paraded before the world. Her words ricocheted across the chamber, desperate and furious. But Charles, unshaken, cut her down with icy precision. Each time she spat another charge, his responses grew sharper, colder, final. His authority filled the room like steel, silencing every echo of her protest. There was no room for negotiation, no chance for reversal. Her crown was stripped, her title dissolved, her place in royal history ripped away before her very eyes. In that devastating instant, the balance of power didn't just shift. It collapsed in her face. What had once lingered in whispers, hinted at in shadows, was now undeniable reality, etched in the silence that followed her fall. The king had stripped his queen of her crown, not in private silence, but before the very family that had doubted her from the beginning. The air was heavy with disbelief, though beneath it ran the cold current of inevitability. This was no accident, no rash decree. It was the climax of years of tension, betrayal, and secrets now dragged into the light. Yet, even as Camilla's title dissolved, the true reckoning had only begun. Out of the ruins, two figures rose stronger than ever, William and Catherine. They had played the game of silence with such mastery that the crown itself seemed to tilt toward them. The confrontation between Charles and Camilla may have stolen the breath from the chamber, but when the echoes faded, what remained was more dangerous than shock. It was realization. William and Catherine had been waiting in the shadows all along. They had not shouted, nor schemed openly. Instead, with patience, precision, and ruthless timing, they ensured that when Camilla fell, the crown's weight slid naturally into their grasp. William's role in this silent maneuver was far more intricate than the calm expression he wore during the confrontation suggested. Behind closed doors, he had long pressed his father with carefully chosen words, urging him to reckon with the public's growing resentment and the danger it posed to the crown itself. He never forced, never demanded, but planted doubts with precision, slipping arguments into moments when Charles's guard was lowest. It was not manipulation, it was strategy. William understood his father's deep sensitivity to public opinion and wielded it like a blade, steering him, gently, inexorably, toward the unthinkable decision. What appeared to be Charles's spontaneous act of authority was, in truth, the culmination of William's steady, unseen pressure. Catherine's role was no less vital, though hers unfolded in whispers rather than counsel. Through quiet diplomacy, she wove threads of loyalty across the palace, staff, advisors, allies, ensuring that when the storm came, allegiance flowed toward her and William. She did not need to command loyalty. She cultivated it until it was theirs by default. She never spoke against Camilla directly. To do so would have been reckless. Instead, she built her case in silence, an image of steadiness, compassion, and grace that stood in stark contrast to Camilla's increasingly embattled presence. To the staff who mattered most, Catherine was no longer merely the Princess of Wales. She was the inevitable future, the queen in waiting, who would carry the crown with dignity into a new age. One fact loomed above all: the crown would never look the same again. In a single afternoon, decades of tradition, secrecy, and power had been rewritten. The monarchy had been reshaped, not gently, but with decisive force. The reverberations would echo through history, changing how the public, the media, and even insiders would view the crown forever. If you're hooked by this royal showdown, hit that like, share this jaw-dropping story, and subscribe so you don't miss the next explosive revelation. The crown's drama is far from over.